Welcome to Beyond the Limits with your hosts, me, Matt Clark.
And me, Mike Forsyth.
Today, we're going to try and answer the question, does CBD oil offer a legitimate wellness benefit, or is it primarily just hype? We're going to be looking at what CBD is, how it works, and some of the proposed use cases. We will review the evidence and then discuss the strengths and the flaws in this. Now, unfortunately, those looking for a simple answer, please look elsewhere. This is complicated. But, of course, that is why you're tuning in, to get up to speed with the evidence so that you can make informed decisions for yourself going forward. Now, Mike, I'd like to just take some time here to say thank you to our listeners. We've had lots of emails and suggested guests. We've had lots of new subscribers recently to the show, and I certainly don't know this many people, so whoever you are, thank you. We're also soon going to be launching a letterbox feature, so please direct your questions and your challenges to beyondthelimitspod@gmail.com. And also, if you like the show, please do hit the follow button. Now, Mike, do you want to get us started on this murky topic? What is CBD and what forms can we get it in?
Yeah, CBD is a topic that I've thought about for a while. And actually, the reason I wanted to do this was I had someone who actually brought this up. They said that they hadn't really thought of CBD, but had used it just on a whim and found that they'd slept a lot better. And I know we're going to talk about sleep and the effects that might have with that. But just to give some background, as you alluded to, we're going to talk about CBD. So CBD stands for cannabidiol, and I only had to practice saying that about 14 times before we hit record. Essentially, so this is a non-intoxicating compound that's found in the cannabis plant. So the cannabis plant has got the full name of Cannabis sativa, and the key point here is this doesn't cause a high like cannabis. So the part of the cannabis that causes the high is called THC. So that's your tetrahydrocannabinol. Lots of long names that I'm going to persistently butcher, but worth remembering just to understand this explainer here. There are over 100 identified cannabinoids, of which CBD is one. So Matt, I know you love an orchestra analogy, and loyal listeners will remember a pretty good one you came up with a few weeks ago. I'm going to have my attempt at an orchestra analogy. So if we think of cannabis, the plant, as a full orchestra, so it contains many different instruments, the cannabinoids like THC, CBD, CBG, all of the acronyms that you could possibly think of. And they are all playing together to create this complex symphony of effects, if you will. So particular effects that you feel when you ingest the cannabis plant in whatever form that may be. So CBD is essentially like a single instrument from that orchestra. So it can play its own music, but it doesn't produce perhaps the full immersive sound of the entire orchestra, particularly if something like THC, which in this analogy is something like the trumpet, so it's pretty loud, it can drown out everything else. But we're just talking about one single instrument here, and I hope that kind of makes sense.
Can I just compliment you? I mean, it's a valiant attempt with the orchestra analogy. I like it. I guess it's worth pointing out as well, though, and you quite rightly identified that CBD is just one instrument, because I think there's a lot of confusion, isn't there? Certainly when I previously would have looked at CBD, I think there's part of me that just thinks cannabis, and you just think the broader orchestra, when actually it's supposedly just one instrument. And it's worth also mentioning that THC is illegal, isn't it? That is still a Class 1 substance in the States and a Class B drug in the UK.
Yeah, absolutely. Worth making that point, and I think we'll allude to that a little bit further on. So, as you said in the intro, CBD comes in a whole load of different forms. So some of you may be familiar with CBD oil. That is one option. There are loads of others. So there's tinctures, there's capsule, there's pills, there's these edible gummies that are very popular, drinks, creams, lotions, balms, salves, vapes, whatever you can think of, pretty much you can get CBD from.
Exercise leggings.
Well, that's new to me, but I will defer to you when it comes to expertise on exercise leggings, clearly. So we've talked a little bit about how you can ingest it or how you can take it, but actually just breaking down CBD into compositions is worth doing too. So you can either get pure CBD, so this is, as the name alludes to, the purest form of CBD. All the other compounds found in the cannabis plant that I mentioned, they've been removed, so it leaves more than 99% of pure CBD. Now, this is really good, obviously, if people want to avoid THC entirely, or those who just want to get a very pure form of the product. Now, I don't know, Matt, if you came across something called the entourage effect in your research, but this is the benefit believed to occur when multiple cannabis compounds work together. So this is a lot of the instruments together. So maybe it's not the whole orchestra, but maybe it's the woodwind section or whatever. So obviously, if you've got isolated CBD, so pure CBD, you're not going to get that. So you can go for more of a broad spectrum CBD. So that's got other minor cannabinoids in, potentially terpenes as well. Now, important to note again, the THC will be specifically removed or reduced to non-detectable levels. Again, the benefits of this, perhaps you might get more of this so-called entourage effect. And then the third option is you go for a kind of full spectrum CBD. So that's where this contains all of the naturally occurring compounds found in the cannabis plant, but essentially just trace amounts of the THC to bring it to within that legal limit. And we'll mention this again, I'm sure, but in the US, the legal limit of THC is 0.3%, whereas in the UK, it is 0.2%. So how does CBD actually work in the body? CBD and any of the cannabinoids work on your endocannabinoid system. So that's this complex cell signaling system found in actually all vertebrates, including humans. And the ECS, as it's commonly known, it's involved in a vast array of physiological processes. So it can affect mood and stress, pain sensation, your sleep, your appetite and your digestion, even your immune function and memory and learning. Now, interestingly, with CBD, it doesn't actually bind to your cannabinoid receptors. THC does, but CBD doesn't. Instead, it seems to interact with the ECS in a slightly more indirect ways. So interestingly, it works slightly differently from THC, or that's the theory at least. But I think this will make sense when we talk about particularly the claims that people have when it comes to the effects of CBD.
Can I also mention the bioavailability, which I think is a really important kind of concept to understand for those using or considering CBD products. So bioavailability means the availability or the uptake of the active ingredient depending on the mechanism by which you take it. So if you're rubbing it on your skin, or if you're drinking it or eating it, or putting it in your leggings or your infused mascara, and I'm not making that up when I've genuinely seen products claiming to be CBD infused, bath bombs as well, by the way. We have to acknowledge the bioavailability, and that is the readiness for the active ingredient to actually kind of get to where you want it to be. And a quick note on that. So it's most bioavailable if it's inhaled. So if you're vaping it or smoking it, potentially this is about half of it might get absorbed. We obviously have some concerns with anyone using a CBD vape due to the vector chemicals that are actually being used to deliver the CBD into the lungs can be significantly harmful for the lungs. Actually eating it shows to be one of the poorest ways of getting the active substance to you, with only around somewhere between 5 to 10% of the active substance actually being absorbed from your digestive tract. I think that's probably worth noting.
That's interesting, isn't it? Because the gummies, particularly in the US, and it's worth mentioning that the vast majority of consumers of CBD worldwide at the moment are in North America. But gummies seem to be by far and away the most popular way of consuming this. It's interesting you say that it doesn't actually work particularly well ingesting these.
Yeah, I think most people won't know that. I also think the dosing of these products is pretty crazy. I've seen that bottles of these oils will suggest on the front 1,000 milligrams. Now, this doesn't make clear that this is 1,000 milligrams in the entire tub rather than, per dose. And some are just presenting these kind of odd percentages, like 5% to 2.8%. I think it's incredibly cryptic for, someone picking these off the shelf as to really understanding what it is they're taking, and also how much are they actually going to be absorbing.
Yeah, I think really good point. And I'd like to come back to that at the end, because we might try and break this down for anyone who is wanting to try this, about important things to consider. I think strength is one of those. Talk to me about why CBD is a big deal, and also what are the claims? Like what are people saying that this can actually do?
Yeah, so it's a big deal because it is a big deal. People seem to be parting with their cash for these products. So the global CBD industry is estimated at $202 billion in 2025, with an annual growth rate of 45% over the last 2 years. Now, in the UK market, it was estimated that £300 million was spent on CBD products last year. So it is a big market, and it's very popular. I think some of the popularity surge is explained by this increasing interest in wellness products, probably driven by marketing and maybe some anecdotal reports. There's certainly a few buzzwords that can be utilized to promote or drive this. It's got, it's got a broad consumer appeal. It's seen as non-addictive, non-psychoactive. It aligns with this, like I said, this growing interest in self-care. It's called a natural product. It's definitely involved in this sober, curious movement. Now, I think looking at the shelves, there's a growing kind of collection of these nootropics, or these alcohol replacements. And I think there's a progressive movement away from alcohol and a subsequent rise in products offering kind of calming or relaxing alternatives. And I guess that's just one specific use case. But the claims of CBD, so it goes from everything to being calming, relaxing, good for sleep, beneficial for immune cells, beneficial for our skin, anti-inflammatory for neural cells. And I think it's easy to understand why the claims are so broad and so vast. Like you said earlier with the endocannabinoid system. Goodness me, endocannabinoid system. That is quite a mouthful, isn't it? It's taken some rehearsing, I'll be honest, listeners. Other claims, which are less common but are still seen, are its benefits for things like nausea, appetite regulation, addiction, and certain neurological disorders beyond epilepsy, which we'll talk about in a moment. But just, I guess, a side note on these claims, and that we need to understand what can be claimed by these products. So food supplements cannot make specific claims. I think you'll notice from the packaging that they are incredibly broad and incredibly vague. Things like may support well-being and wellness. If they make specific claims on a product, and that becomes something that they have to prove, and they will need a license for that. So I think you'll see that the claims are just very broad because these are all just still food supplements ultimately. Now, Mike, I'm actually really curious. Have you ever tried any?
Yeah, so I have actually, and we haven't talked about this before, but I did. I was interested, and I think the reasons that you outlined, I was curious as much as anything else. And so I went into my local pharmacy. I didn't really know what I was looking for. There seemed to be some that seemed really strong and some that seemed much more weak. So I, being a slightly naturally cautious predisposition, chose quite a mild variety. Had to pay through the teeth for it, I might add, but chose some oil, I think, and tried it. So dropped it beneath my tongue a few nights in a row. And look, I will be honest, I felt absolutely no effect from it whatsoever. N equals one, my experience was pretty mundane, and actually I didn't go back to it.
Yes, I was just thinking how you worded that, and you naturally cautious. I think I probably tend to be on the other end of the spectrum, but I naturally curious myself. I bought I think it's quite a prominent brand. Have you heard of Trip, the cans? They've got Trip on
Yeah.
them. Very nicely packaged, and beautiful colors and delicious flavors. I bought a pack of this and sat down and thought, right, like all good researchers should, I'll give this a whirl. And I drank 5 cans straight, kind of back to back, and I was just peeing. I didn't feel anything. I was quite disappointed, like I just drank loads of pop. So I think they have 10 milligrams per can, if I'm right in thinking. So I was, hasten to say, a little bit uninspired by that. Okay, so rather than waffling on about our own personal experiences, why don't we move on to looking at the evidence and give our listeners some actual credible insights that they can maybe make the decision on themselves. So let's break this down into where there is some good evidence, and then we can talk a little bit about on where the evidence might not be so robust. I will start. I have looked at what I think is probably the best evidence for CBD products. So there are a few medicines that utilize CBD. These are obviously pharmaceutical grade. These are approved in the States, in the UK and the EU, and there's 2 that come to mind that I've looked at. The first is called Epidiolex. Now, this is, it must be a very, very specific use case. This is proven as effective for a couple of incredibly rare syndromes that I'd never heard of. One called Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, or Dravet syndrome. I don't even know how these are pronounced. Or tuberous sclerosis complex. Now, I had actually heard of that last one, but I've never seen any cases of this. But I can see that this has a proven use case here. And my takeaways from this were, these are severe, life-limiting and debilitating syndromes. It's very specific, but it's actually quite impressive. There is a 70% reduction in seizure frequency for these conditions, which is particularly interesting because it's effective when other more typical anti-epileptic medications, even used in combination of the traditional medicines, have been ineffective. This is prescription only and is a million miles away from taking CBD for bettering of sleep, for example. The second one is something called Sativex. So this is for use in MS-related spasticity and can help with certain pain within that. But I guess it's worth saying that actually the CBD here is in combination with other parts of the cannabinoids, and there is THC in this product as well. So I think pure CBD here, I'm not sure if we can kind of conclude, I'm not sure if we can use this as evidence for that. Now, there are some other things that do show promising evidence, and this is probably more relevant for this for the broader society or for our listeners. And this is looking at anxiety. There are some promising studies looking at specific types of anxiety, and one particular meta-analysis. So this is the highest level of evidence that we have, which was published in 2024 in Psychiatry Research, looked at over 1,500 different studies and screened these for suitability, and actually only deemed 8 as being suitable for inclusion. But this was interesting. They looked at studies with patients with a baseline of a validated anxiety syndrome, either generalized anxiety disorder, social anxiety disorder, and PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. It found statistically significant improvements in anxiety symptoms compared to those receiving the placebo. Now that sounds pretty good, doesn't it? Looking into this a little bit further, though, I'm a little bit troubled by, despite these 8 studies being included, this only totaled 245 patients. The second thing that troubles me here is that the doses in these studies were up to 800 milligrams. Now, these are huge doses that aren't found recommended in products that you can buy at the moment.
I think the evidence for general everyday stress relief with your typical kind of retail CBD products is far less robust, but certainly an interesting finding.
I think it's good for our listeners to remember some of these doses, because we'll talk about the risks a bit later on, and specific dose-related risks. So before we do that, though, Mike, I know that you've also looked at some evidence. Do you want to take us forward?
Yeah, definitely. So I'm going to focus more on the conditions or the situations where the evidence isn't quite so promising or isn't as robust. Worth just caveating that by saying a lot of this is perhaps because the studies weren't very big, or it's something that is in the pipeline. So watch this space. Some of this may change, but there are a lot of claims, as we alluded to, about CBD. So some of these have been challenged by doing research on this. So the first is chronic pain, particularly in the context of kind of general over-the-counter use. So these CBD products that you can buy yourself. Essentially, they've done a whole load of comprehensive reviews, actually very recently as well, from the American College of Physicians. There's a very low certainty of benefit for general chronic non-cancer pain when using retail CBD products. So some of these studies do show promise for pain that involve THC in combination with CBD. So it makes it difficult to isolate CBD's effect alone, but essentially the evidence is pretty weak. There is some recent data that suggests, in fact, that the potential harms may outweigh the benefits for these retail products. The second one is sleep. And I think this is the one that I was most interested in, just because, as I said, anecdotally, people have told me that it has helped their sleep. Actually, unfortunately, whilst there are many claims that exist, pilot trials that have done, and again, these are early stages, but they actually show very little significant difference from placebo on your core sleep outcomes. So that means really the time to fall asleep or the sleep duration, and that's with typical doses. So any perceived benefit they feel, or they've concluded in these studies, may actually be secondary to potentially that reduction in anxiety or a strong placebo effect, rather than actually the direct impact on your sleep mechanisms. So a couple of other things worth mentioning. General inflammation, again, that's a claim that's made quite regularly. The evidence is limited, mainly because there is a little bit of what we call preclinical evidence from lab and animal studies suggesting it might have some anti-inflammatory properties, but it's not consistently translated to your kind of robust clinical proof for treating widespread human inflammatory conditions. There are so many others. I could go on forever. I mentioned just a final few, so I can kind of clump these into one, really. But when we think about other serious conditions, say your cancer treatment or prevention, IBS, autism, depression, ADHD, addiction, all of those kind of things, essentially very limited human data. Again, anecdotal reports, but there's no robust, high-quality clinical evidence at the moment to support CBD as an effective treatment for any of these. I think that the takeaway point from here is that consumers should be really skeptical of marketing claims suggesting efficacy, because actually there really isn't the evidence there yet.
Yeah, I think that's a nice summary, Mike. Thanks. I think being skeptical is important, and I also think considering risks is also important. There are some common side effects that are reported with CBD products. So things like fatigue, dry mouth, reduced appetite, diarrhea, drowsiness, generally mild but can be impactful. Now, the two main risks I want to talk about are firstly something called hepatotoxicity or liver injury. Now, what is this? So the FSA, or the Food Standards Agency, has noted that adverse effects on the liver were observed at doses of CBD at 5 milligrams per kilogram per body weight per day in patients. And this is in healthy human volunteers. This is the dose equivalent to about 350 milligrams in a 70 kilogram adult. Now, what makes this worse is that the data in the literature also suggests that humans might be more sensitive to the adverse effects of CBD in the liver than in laboratory animals. And lots of the evidence that we just talked about is looking at preclinical stuff. So these are studies that are done in animals. So the FSA, which is an independent advisory body in the UK, can actually be trusted here. This is not this is not someone selling you something. This is an independent body. Another clinical trial led by the FDA, so this is in the States and this is in 2025, showed that studies with Epidiolex, so one of these medications that we talked about earlier, has shown a dose-dependent elevation in liver enzymes. So depending on how much you take, they observed that the liver enzymes went up. This was found in 5 to 6% of users and even at consumer level doses. Now, why do we worry about liver injury? So I think it's important to stress that things like liver inflammation are silent. These are things that you won't feel. You won't get pain in your tummy. You won't feel feverish. These are very much silent and might not even show any symptoms at all until your liver is so inflamed that it's actually failing. So this is serious stuff. The second significant problem with CBD that's been reported is that it can inhibit key liver enzymes, and this can mean common interactions with other medications that might be metabolized by the liver. Ultimately, what this can lead to is an increase in the levels of other drugs in the body that you might be taking if you're supplementing with CBD. This is particularly important for those on blood thinners like warfarin, on anti-epileptic medications, some antidepressants, and statins. I think generally speaking, as a good rule of thumb, if on your medication box, if it says do not take these medications with grapefruit, that's probably a good rule of thumb in terms of which medications would be susceptible to this interaction with CBD. Now, there are other concerns and there are other risks with these products as well. So of course, this is an unregulated market, like we've talked about already. With all of these things that are nascent and are poorly studied, we have to acknowledge the unknowns. An example of this might be that CBD increases the amount of sleep. No one really knows if you're using this long term and it's consistently changing your sleep architecture, that you're then depriving yourself of the natural adaptations to this architecture that you need. It's worth noting that in October of 2023, the Food Standard Agency issued an updated precautionary advice on CBD, recommending that for healthy adults that they should limit their consumption of CBD from food to 10 milligrams per day, which is about 4 to 5 drops of 5% CBD oil. That is not a very big dose. Now, Mike, what do you think on all this? In conclusion, do you actually think this is worth trying?
Yeah, look, it's tricky, isn't it? I think there will be potentially people shouting at us right now saying, look, I use this, it works, I sleep so much better with it, it helps me with X, Y, or Z, I feel, less anxious as a result. And I think as long as it's done safely, great, absolutely no issue with that. I think it does just feel, particularly with CBD, even more so than some of these other products that we've spoken about previously, that it does just feel such like a wild west of, as you say, everything is infused with CBD now. Now, I would argue that the vast majority of these are absolutely useless. They're going to have no effect whatsoever. But as you've just alluded to quite nicely, there are risks here if this is not used appropriately, if it's interacting with other medications. So there are important factors to consider. I did also think it'd be worth just mentioning very quickly that if anyone does want to try CBD and wants to go and buy it, there are a few things just worth considering in terms of safety before you do so. You want to check that, firstly, and I think this is quite important actually, that the product itself has had something called a COA, which is a certificate of analysis. That essentially says that it's a reputable brand. It's been analysed from an independent third-party lab for every batch of their product. So that gives you a good idea about the cannabinoid profile and potency, also the THC content to make sure it's legal. and if there are any contaminants involved. So I think that's really important to bear in mind. Secondly, we talked about, and I alluded to this at the start, but the type of CBD. So is this a full spectrum CBD? Is it a broad spectrum, or is it a CBD isolate? A few other things to consider. So the hemp source. So its majority is hemp-based CBD, which is sold. So looking at where the hemp has been cultivated, that's important because hemp is what we call a bioaccumulator. It absorbs substances from the soil. So organically grown hemp, free from pesticides, herbicides, heavy metals, all of that stuff is probably the one to look for. There are various other things. The extraction method, I think ideally CO2 extraction is gold standard. And then, as you alluded to, I think the potency and the dosage is really important, because actually that's quite confusing when you look at the label. The advice is generally to start with a low dose, so that's your 5 to 10 milligrams. But as you say, I think actually 10 milligrams should be thought of as a kind of upper limit, particularly with the risks that you've described. Are you more positive on this? You're generally more positive about these things than me. I feel like I'm just the cynical kind of narky one. But what are your thoughts?
No, not really. I think I'm a bit of a skeptic here as well. I've realised there's one thing that we haven't mentioned, and that is, you made some really good points about kind of what to look for when choosing one of these products. I think it's really worth mentioning that if your line of work, if you're an elite sportsman, or if you are having regular drug tests because you're in the army or whatever, if it is contaminated with THC because of a lack of stringent production standards, or if it is one of these entourage delivery products that has, some of the other cannabinoids in it, notably THC, that you will likely fail the drugs test. This will turn up in your urine. The breakdown products of THC will be picked up in a urine test. So it's just worth being aware of that. In summary, my thoughts are that this isn't simple, and I think the studies are all often conflicting in their evidence. I thought it was interesting to see how cannabinoids show promise in treating things like anorexia and poor appetite in those with cancer undergoing chemotherapy. But then I noticed that in one of the strongest studied use cases for CBD, so in this anti-epileptic role, the most common side effect was appetite suppression. So I think it's confusing, and I think it's challenging. These are obviously different cohorts of people and patients, but the polar opposite downstream symptom here being observed highlights the complexity here. And I'm aware that different people may have different densities of the ECS receptors, they might have different regulation of this system, and how the system may in fact just differ from person to person at different ages and in other psychological or physical states of stress. There are clearly anecdotes of people finding use for this, but unfortunately this may not translate to others broadly, even if their claims are true and genuine. What I can say, which is clearer, that looking at this, there is some promising evidence for CBD at higher doses that I talked about earlier, but counter to this, we have an independent body, the FSA, advising us against anywhere near these doses due to risk of liver inflammation or injury. So yes, I think it's murky, and I certainly won't be recommending this to any of my patients yet, but I will be keenly observing developments in this space.
Good stuff, Matt. Enjoyed that. Thanks everyone for listening. And just to echo Matt's point, this is our 21st episode, and we're really enjoying doing this. So please do reach out with comments, questions. If you want to come on as a guest, give us a shout, and hope everyone is enjoying this. And Matt, catch up soon.
Cheers, Mike.